When the people closest to you cross a line you never imagined they would, the feeling isn't just about betrayal. It's about disbelief that your own family could turn curiosity into carelessness. The day my family accessed my basic work files, it wasn't out of malice. It was out of a sense of entitlement, the quiet assumption that what's mine is theirs. In a family, that logic often feels natural. We share space, food, emotions, memories, and sometimes even our dreams. But there are boundaries that define respect, boundaries that separate affection from intrusion. I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach when I realized those files weren't private anymore. They were opened, read, analyzed, and misunderstood by people who had no idea what they were looking at. It started with a simple question over dinner, my brother asking why I always seemed secretive about my job. I brushed it off with a smile, saying some things are just work-related. But behind that smile was exhaustion, the kind that comes from balancing family life and professional responsibility. I worked on classified projects, things that couldn't be shared, not even with those closest to me. Yet, curiosity has its own gravity. It pulls people in, even when they know they shouldn't go further. My laptop was left on the table one night, a harmless mistake, and that was all it took. When they opened the folder named Basic Work Files, they thought it was just another part of my routine job. But those files contained sensitive communication logs, coded reports, and data tied to national-level projects. To them, it might have looked like strange codes or encrypted lines that didn't make sense. To me, it was my livelihood, my duty, my identity. I imagined their faces as they scrolled through it, whispering, questioning, wondering what it all meant. Maybe they thought I was hiding something. Maybe they thought they were protecting me. But what they didn't realize was that, in that moment, they were stepping into a world they couldn't understand, a world bound by confidentiality and trust. When I came home that night, I could sense something was off. The air felt heavy. My mother looked at me differently, worried, confused. My father avoided eye contact, and my brother, who had probably led the whole exploration, stayed silent. It didn't take long for me to figure it out. The laptop screen was still glowing faintly, the folder still open, and the files still active. I froze. My hands trembled not because I feared their judgment, but because I knew the consequences of that breach. There are some things you can explain to your family, but not to the agencies you work for. Accessing those files, even unknowingly, meant triggering a chain reaction I couldn't stop. The next few hours felt like slow motion. My phone buzzed with alerts from my department. Unauthorized access detected, security breach, location traced. My heart raced faster with each vibration. I wanted to believe it could be fixed quietly, that I could explain it was just a misunderstanding. But reality doesn't work that way when national data is involved. By the time I tried to call my supervisor, it was too late. My family didn't know that their small act of curiosity had turned into a federal alert. They didn't understand the layers of protection built into the system, or how serious such a breach could appear. I remember my mother's shaking voice asking me what was happening when black vehicles pulled up outside the house. The flashing lights painted our living room walls red and blue. My family stood frozen as agents entered, calm but firm, asking for me by name. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in real life, one that I couldn't pause or rewind. In that moment, I wasn't just an employee under investigation, I was a son, a brother, standing between my family's confusion and the cold face of authority. They questioned me about access logs, about who had used my system, about why the files were opened. I tried to explain, but the words got lost between guilt and disbelief. My family watched in silence as I answered every question, each one feeling heavier than the last. The realization of what they had done began to sink in, their expressions changing from defensiveness to regret. I looked at them, not with anger, but with a deep ache that comes from knowing trust has been fractured. They hadn't meant to hurt me, but the damage was real. They crossed a line that should have remained untouched, a line that defines where love ends and respect begins. Privacy isn't just about secrets, it's about space, about the quiet understanding that some things are sacred, even within a family. That night became a mirror for all of us, reflecting the fragile balance between closeness and boundaries, between caring and control, between love and intrusion. When your family crosses a line you thought they never would, the world tilts in a way you can't quite describe. It isn't the loud betrayal that hurts the most. It's the quiet disbelief, the moment you realize that people who should protect your privacy instead invaded it without hesitation. When my family accessed my basic work files, it didn't begin as an act of betrayal. It began as curiosity, a small, almost innocent decision made under the illusion of closeness. In families, we grow up believing that everything is shared: our food, our space, our laughter, even our worries. But there's an invisible boundary, one built on respect, that separates what's personal from what's shared. The night they ignored that boundary, something inside me changed forever. It was an ordinary evening. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, humming softly while I stepped out to take a call. To me, those files were sacred, the heartbeat of my professional life, guarded under layers of passwords and security. I worked on sensitive reports, data that connected to projects beyond my family's understanding. They only saw the label on the folder, basic work files. Maybe it sounded harmless, maybe it even sounded boring. But that word basic was deceptive. What hid inside those files wasn't just work. It was responsibility, trust, and confidentiality that bound me to something far bigger than myself. When I came back, the atmosphere felt strange. My mother's voice trembled slightly when she asked about my job. My father's usual calm had been replaced with unease, and my younger brother avoided my eyes. Something had shifted, and the silence between us was louder than any confrontation could have been. I walked into my room and saw the glow of my laptop screen still on, the folder open, and the documents scattered across the desktop like fragments of my privacy exposed. My heart sank. My hands turned cold. I didn't need to ask who had done it. I knew. And the realization stung more than any argument could have. I remember staring at the files, scrolling through them quickly, hoping they hadn't gone too deep. But the timestamps told the truth. They had explored everything. They didn't know what they were looking at. The codes, the encrypted messages, the strange terminologies. It must have looked suspicious, almost frightening. Maybe they thought I was involved in something secret or dangerous. Maybe they just wanted to understand what I was hiding. Either way, they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In their eyes, it might have been a moment of concern, even love, but to me, it was an intrusion into the one place I thought was untouchable. That night, when I sat in the living room, the weight of their actions pressed heavily on my chest. I tried to explain the importance of confidentiality, the gravity of accessing data not meant for them. My voice trembled between anger and disappointment, but what hurt more was their confusion. They didn't understand why it mattered so much. To them, it was just family being family, no harm intended. But in my world, intentions didn't matter, actions did. And those actions had consequences far beyond what they imagined. Within an hour, the first alert hit my phone. Unauthorized access detected. My name flagged. The system had traced the intrusion to my home network. I tried to stay calm, typing fast, sending reports, calling supervisors, trying to explain what happened. But systems don't listen to emotions. They respond to facts, and the fact was clear: my files were accessed from an unapproved device. My stomach tightened as I realized what was about to unfold. I looked at my family and saw fear beginning to replace confusion. They didn't know the weight of what they had triggered. The sound of cars pulling up outside broke the tension. The flashing lights painted streaks of red and blue across the curtains. My father stood frozen at the window. My mother's hands covered her mouth in shock, and my brother whispered my name as if saying it could stop what was happening. Homeland Security had arrived. The knock on the door was sharp and deliberate. I opened it slowly, trying to appear calm, though my heart pounded so loudly it drowned every other sound. Agents entered, professional but stern, asking questions, scanning devices, confirming identities. My family stood behind me, pale, silent, and stunned. I answered every question, explaining what had happened, trying to protect them while also protecting myself. My mother cried quietly as she realized the seriousness of what they had done. My father kept repeating that it was a mistake, just a misunderstanding. But in that moment, words felt small compared to the magnitude of what had been set in motion. The trust that once held our family together felt fragile, like glass cracking under pressure. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't lash out, I just stood there, trying to hold together the pieces of something that could never go back to the way it was that night. When the agents finally left, the silence that filled the house was heavier than before. My family avoided my gaze, guilt and fear written across their faces. I wanted to comfort them, but a part of me couldn't. They hadn't just opened a folder, they had opened a wound that would take years to heal. The sense of security, the belief that home was a safe place, had been shaken. I sat alone afterward, staring at the faint glow of my laptop screen, realizing that some lines, once crossed, redraw every definition of love, loyalty, and trust. You thought you understood. Trust within a family is like invisible glass, transparent, beautiful, but fragile. It lets love pass through, but one careless touch can shatter it beyond repair. The line between trust and invasion is thinner than anyone realizes. For years, I believed my family understood me, respected my privacy, and knew the boundaries that separated my professional world from our personal one. But that belief was tested the night they crossed that invisible line. What makes it worse is that they didn't see it as betrayal. They saw it as concern, as curiosity, as something harmless. They thought they were entitled to know everything about me because blood gives permission. But blood doesn't give the right to break trust. It gives the duty to protect it. I remember sitting at the dinner table that evening, surrounded by familiar faces and familiar warmth, but beneath the laughter, there was tension I couldn't place. My mother asked gently what exactly I worked on. My father joined in, saying he was proud, but also wanted to understand what kept me so guarded. My brother joked that maybe I was working for some secret organization. I laughed along, brushing it off, thinking it was just family teasing. But beneath that laughter, they were already building questions, doubts, and assumptions. The curiosity that began as love slowly started to twist into intrusion. That's how invasion often starts. It wears the mask of care until it forgets where to stop. When they went through my files, it wasn't just about opening documents or seeing work they didn't understand. It was about stepping into a world I had spent years protecting. That boundary wasn't there to keep them out. It was there to keep everyone safe. In my line of work, every document carried weight. Every code line carried responsibility. I didn't hide things because I didn't trust them. I hid things because I was bound to something greater than family ties. But how do you explain boundaries to people who think love means access? How do you tell them that their concern feels like intrusion when it's mixed with disbelief? The thin line between trust and invasion became clearer when I saw their faces after the incident. My mother's eyes filled with guilt, but also confusion. She didn't understand why I was so hurt. My father defended their actions, saying they had a right to know what was happening under their roof. My brother, the one who first opened the files, apologized but not fully. He said he was just curious, that he didn't mean harm. That word, curious, echoed in my mind for days. It wasn't about meaning harm. It was about not respecting space. Trust isn't built on intentions. It's built on awareness. And they had forgotten that in families, boundaries often get blurred because love is used as an excuse. We're your family, they said. We deserve to know. But deserving to know isn't the same as having the right to invade. The line between the two is invisible, yet powerful. The moment you cross it, trust stops feeling safe. It becomes something fragile, something you question every time someone looks over your shoulder or asks too many questions. I used to leave my laptop open without a second thought, used to share updates freely. But after that night, I began closing everything, locking screens, protecting passwords. It wasn't paranoia, it was self-preservation. It was what happens when the people who should protect your privacy are the ones who take it away. I still remember the moment when the agents arrived. The chaos that followed wasn't just about the files, it was about broken trust. My family kept asking how something so small could turn into something so serious. But what they couldn't see was that small actions reveal big truths. If they had trusted me, they would have waited for answers instead of seeking them in secret. If they had faith, they would have asked rather than assumed. Trust demands patience, but invasion feeds on impatience. They didn't wait to understand, they acted to satisfy their own doubts. And in doing so, they turned a home into a place of suspicion. That night, the house felt divided. The air was thick with guilt and misunderstanding. They tried to comfort me, to tell me they did it because they cared. I wanted to believe them, but every word felt hollow. Love that crosses boundaries doesn't feel like love, it feels like control disguised as concern. My father kept saying, "We're family, we should share everything." But I couldn't find the words to tell him that some things aren't meant to be shared, not because they're secrets, but because they're sacred. Trust isn't about giving access to everything. It's about knowing what shouldn't be touched even days later. I found myself thinking about that line, the one that separates trust from invasion. It's invisible, but it's everything. It's the space that lets you breathe freely, that gives you your own identity even among those who love you. When it's respected, love feels safe. When it's crossed, love starts to feel suffocating. That night taught me that sometimes, the people closest to you can make you feel the most exposed, not because they don't love you, but because they don't understand how to love you without crossing that line. The hardest part isn't forgiving them, it's learning to trust them again without fearing that next time, curiosity will once again disguise itself as care. A misunderstanding is like a spark. It starts small, almost invisible, but if left unchecked, it can burn down everything you thought was safe. What happened that night began as something so simple, so unintentional, yet it spiraled into chaos faster than anyone could have imagined. When my family accessed my work files, they didn't mean to cause harm. They didn't realize what those files contained, what they represented, or what rules surrounded them. They just saw documents filled with strange codes, confidential-looking formats, and encrypted data, and their minds started to fill in the blanks with their own fears. In their attempt to understand, they misinterpreted, and that misinterpretation grew into something none of us could control. It's strange how quickly trust can turn into suspicion. My family had always known I worked on projects I couldn't discuss openly. I had mentioned that my job required confidentiality, but I never imagined they would mistake that silence for secrecy. That night, when they opened the folder marked Basic Work Files, they must have thought it was harmless. But once they began to scroll through those pages of data and saw the unfamiliar symbols and security markings, their curiosity turned into concern, and concern turned into panic. In their eyes, I was no longer their son or brother simply working late nights. I was someone hiding something dangerous, something forbidden. They didn't understand that what they were seeing wasn't a secret. It was classified work that demanded trust and discretion. I can still imagine their whispered conversations as they huddled around my laptop. My brother trying to make sense of the codes, my father insisting something was wrong, my mother torn between worry and disbelief. They didn't come to me. They didn't ask. Instead, they drew their own conclusions, connecting dots that didn't exist, creating a story in their minds that had no truth to it. That's the power of misunderstanding. It feeds on silence. It thrives in the absence of communication. If only they had waited, if only they had asked, everything could have been prevented. But in their haste to protect me, they ended up putting all of us at risk. When I walked into the room that night, the look on their faces said everything. They were anxious, nervous, guilty, but above all, afraid. They thought they had discovered something terrible, something that would bring consequences to our door. My mother's trembling voice asked me what I was involved in. My father demanded to know why there were encrypted government seals in my files. I tried to explain, but their emotions were louder than my words. They didn't want explanations, they wanted reassurance, and at that moment, I couldn't give it. I could only feel my stomach twist as I realized how badly they had misunderstood everything. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. The files they had opened weren't meant to be accessed outside secure networks. Their activity triggered alerts, automatic security protocols that detected unauthorized entry. Within hours, the system flagged my account, traced the IP, and reported it to the higher authorities. To them, it looked like a potential breach, a possible leak of sensitive information. I was helpless as I watched my world unravel from a single act of misplaced curiosity. When the black vehicles arrived outside our home, it was as though a nightmare had stepped through our front door. My family, the same people who had caused the misunderstanding, stood frozen, unable to comprehend how something so small had become something so big. The agents came in with calm precision, asking questions, verifying details, searching devices. My parents stood beside me, pale and trembling. My brother tried to explain that it was all a mistake, but his voice cracked under pressure. I felt torn between anger and pity, between wanting to shout and wanting to shield them from the consequences of their own actions. I knew they hadn't meant harm, but I also knew how little intention mattered in moments like these. Misunderstanding doesn't care about intent, it only cares about results. And the result that night was chaos, fear, and a house filled with disbelief as the agents went through their procedures. I caught glimpses of my mother's tears, my father's trembling hands, my brother's silent regret. I wanted to tell them that it would be okay, but I couldn't. I didn't know if it would. They had triggered something far beyond our control, and now we were all caught in its wake. I could see the confusion in their eyes, the desperate wish to turn back time. They finally understood that what they thought was concern had turned into destruction. That's the cruel truth about misunderstandings. They don't just distort facts. They destroy peace. When the agents finally left, the silence in the house was unbearable. No one spoke for a long time. My father sat on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. My mother whispered prayers under her breath. My brother looked at me with guilt that words couldn't fix. I should have felt relief that it was over, but I didn't. The air between us was heavy, poisoned by what had happened. The misunderstanding had ended, but its shadow remained. Trust was fractured, and though I wanted to forgive them, I couldn't forget the chaos that had unfolded from one careless act in the days that followed. We tried to move forward, but everything felt different. Every conversation carried hesitation. Every shared glance carried unspoken remorse. What started as curiosity had become a chain reaction of fear and consequences. I learned that misunderstandings don't always come from strangers. Sometimes they come from the people who love you most. The ones who think they're protecting you but end up pulling the ground from under your feet. The emotional impact of false suspicion cuts deeper than any visible wound because it questions something fundamental, your integrity. It makes you look at yourself through the eyes of doubt, and that reflection is unbearable. When my family accessed my work files and that act spiraled into chaos, it wasn't just my privacy that was invaded, it was my identity that was shattered. For years, I had built my life around loyalty, discipline, and trust in my work. But that night, when Homeland Security showed up and my family looked at me as though they didn't know who I was, something inside me broke in a way I couldn't describe. Being falsely suspected by strangers is painful, but when that suspicion begins at home, it destroys something sacred. The night began with confusion, but quickly turned into fear. My family stood near the window, watching the flashing lights outside, their faces pale and uncertain. My mother's voice shook as she asked me what was happening, my father's hands trembled, and my brother stood frozen, unable to speak. I tried to explain, but how could I? How do you tell your family that the misunderstanding they caused has now made you a suspect in your own home? Their eyes searched mine for answers, but behind their fear, I saw something that cut me deeper than any accusation from a stranger: the doubt. That single, quiet moment where love hesitated and suspicion took its place. The agents moved efficiently, scanning my devices, asking direct questions. Their professionalism didn't make it easier. Every question they asked felt like a needle pressing into the cracks already forming inside me. They didn't accuse outright, but the implication was there, hanging in the air. I could see my family watching me, wondering if maybe, just maybe, I had done something wrong. That thought alone burned. I had devoted my life to my work, to honesty, to service, and now, because of one act of carelessness, I stood in front of both my family and the authorities trying to prove that I wasn't hiding anything. It felt like standing on trial without having committed a crime. When the questioning ended and the agents left, I sat in the silence that followed. My family tried to speak, but the words came out broken. My mother reached for me, her touch hesitant, as if she wasn't sure if I was still the same person. My father began to explain himself, saying they just wanted to understand, that they never imagined this could happen. My brother muttered apologies, his voice low, full of guilt. But it didn't change the feeling that lingered in the room. It wasn't just about the breach of trust anymore, it was about the way they had looked at me during those moments of suspicion. Once that seed is planted, even if it's small, it grows roots deep inside you. I spent nights replaying every moment in my head, thinking about the expression on their faces, the tone in their voices. I remembered the way my mother's eyes darted between me and the agents, as if she didn't know what to believe. I remembered the hesitation in my father's words, the silence from my brother. Those tiny pauses, those seconds of uncertainty, hurt more than any accusation ever could. It made me question everything I had believed about unconditional love. Family is supposed to be the place where you're believed without explanation, where trust is automatic. But that night, I realized that even love can falter under fear. In the days that followed, the house didn't feel the same. Conversations were quiet, cautious, and filled with unspoken tension. They were trying, I could see it. My mother made my favorite meals, my father tried to engage me in small talk, my brother helped around the house. But beneath every gesture, there was guilt, and beneath my responses, there was pain. The emotional distance that had formed between us was invisible but undeniable. I wanted to forgive them, but I couldn't stop remembering the way they looked at me, the way their faith had cracked. Every smile they gave me after that night felt like an apology that words couldn't deliver. Being falsely suspected changes the way you see everything. It makes you cautious with your words, careful with your actions, and distant from people who used to be your safe place. I began spending more time alone, burying myself in work, not because I wanted to avoid them, but because I didn't know how to be around them without feeling the ache of what happened. My family sensed it, and their silence grew heavier with each passing day. The house that once echoed with laughter now echoed with regret. Even though the misunderstanding was cleared officially, emotionally it left scars that no apology could erase. At night, when I lay in bed, I often thought about how easily trust can crumble. One misunderstanding, one wrong assumption, one moment of fear, that's all it takes. The false suspicion that night wasn't just about me or my job. It became a mirror showing how fragile relationships can be when fear replaces faith. The pain of being doubted by people who should have believed in me without questions stayed longer than the memory of the flashing lights or the questions from the agents. It settled deep, turning into a quiet sadness that followed me in every conversation, every glance, every attempt to go back to normal. What I learned in those moments wasn't just about boundaries or mistakes. It was about the emotional toll of losing trust, even for a moment. When someone suspects you falsely, it changes not just how you see them, but how you see yourself. You start to doubt your own worth, wondering if maybe you did something wrong to deserve that look of uncertainty. You start to measure love differently, not by words or gestures, but by silence, by pauses, by the absence of belief. And no matter how much time passes, there's always a part of you that flinches when someone says they trust you, because now you know how easily that trust can break. Rebuilding trust after betrayal isn't about forgiveness. It's about learning how to stand in the same room with people who broke something inside you and pretending it's whole again. After that night, when my family's actions led to chaos and suspicion, the hardest part wasn't explaining what happened, it was learning how to exist with them afterward. Every morning, I'd wake up to the same house, the same faces, the same routines, but nothing felt the same. The warmth that once filled our home had turned into a quiet discomfort. They tried to act normal, but silence has a way of revealing the things people try to hide. Every conversation felt careful, every smile forced, every act of kindness shadowed by guilt. Trust doesn't return just because someone says sorry. It returns when actions start to rebuild what was broken, and even then, it never feels the same. I remember the first time my father tried to talk to me after the incident. He stood by the doorway, his voice low and cautious, asking if I wanted tea. I could tell he wanted to say more, to explain himself again, but the words wouldn't come. He had always been strong, confident, the pillar of our family. But now he looked uncertain, as though one wrong word could make everything worse. My mother was softer in her approach. She cooked my favorite meals, checked in quietly, and often looked at me with tearful eyes that carried both love and regret. My brother, on the other hand, avoided me for days, unable to meet my gaze. When he finally did, he muttered a small apology, but I could see the shame written all over his face. It wasn't enough to erase what happened, but it was a start. Trust doesn't rebuild with words, it rebuilds with time. At first, I couldn't bring myself to leave my laptop unattended. Every time I left a room, I'd close it, lock it, and keep it close, even when I knew they wouldn't touch it again. It wasn't paranoia, it was protection, a reflex born from pain. They noticed it too. My mother once whispered that she understood, that she didn't blame me for being careful now. That single sentence made me realize that they were starting to understand the depth of what they had done, not just to my work, but to my sense of safety. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't about the files anymore, it was about the feeling of being exposed, of losing the invisible wall that separates trust from fear. As the days turned into weeks, small changes began to appear. My family stopped asking questions about my job, stopped pressing for details, and started respecting silence. It was strange at first, that quiet respect, but it was necessary. My father began checking in with me before using anything that wasn't his, even something as small as my notebook. My brother, once careless with words and actions, became mindful, asking before entering my room or borrowing anything of mine. They were learning the language of boundaries, the same language I had been forced to teach them through pain. Slowly, those small actions began to stitch back fragments of what had been torn apart, but rebuilding trust isn't a clean process. There were moments when I'd catch myself questioning their intentions, moments when I'd see them whispering and wonder if they were talking about me. Doubt doesn't vanish, it lingers, quietly waiting for an excuse to rise again. One night, my mother came to my room and sat beside me, her hands trembling as she spoke. She said she wished she could undo everything, that she never wanted to hurt me, that she didn't realize how deep the damage went. I didn't have words to respond. I just sat there, listening, letting her voice fill the silence that had become too heavy to bear. Sometimes rebuilding trust isn't about saying the right thing, it's about sitting in the same space with the pain and letting it breathe. There were times when I questioned if I even wanted to rebuild it. Part of me wanted to keep the distance, to protect myself from ever being hurt like that again. But another part of me, the part that still loved them despite everything, knew that holding on to anger would only deepen the wound. So I tried, slowly, carefully, one moment at a time. I started having breakfast with them again, joining conversations and allowing laughter to return in small doses. It wasn't the same laughter as before, it was quieter, more fragile, but it was real. Every shared smile felt like progress, every small gesture like another brick in the wall we were rebuilding with time. The fear began to fade, replaced by understanding. My family learned that love isn't about knowing everything, it's about respecting what you don't understand. They learned that trust is a fragile thing, one that doesn't come from closeness, but from restraint. And I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to move forward even when part of you still remembers the hurt. The process was slow, uneven, and often painful, but there were moments when I could feel the bond strengthening again, not because we erased what happened, but because we acknowledged it. We learned to exist with the memory without letting it define us. The cracks were still there, visible but no longer raw, reminders of how easy it is to break something precious and how much strength it takes to build it again. Privacy, truth, and forgiveness are three things that only reveal their true value after they've been broken. Before that night, I didn't think much about privacy within my own home. I believed that love and trust were enough to protect everything sacred. But when my family crossed that invisible line, when they opened my files and stepped into a space that wasn't theirs to touch, I realized how fragile privacy really is. It isn't about keeping secrets, it's about having control over your own space, your own story, your own boundaries. The moment someone violates that, something inside you changes. You start guarding your words, your actions, and even your emotions. You learn to build walls around things that once felt safe to leave unguarded. After the incident, I found myself rethinking everything I once believed about truth. Truth used to feel simple, a straight line between right and wrong, between honesty and lies. But when my family accessed my files and the misunderstanding grew into something larger, I saw how truth could be twisted, misread, and doubted. My truth was that I had nothing to hide, that my work was just part of who I was. But to them, the same truth looked like secrecy. They saw hidden meanings where there were none, danger where there was only duty. And in their fear, they believed something that wasn't real. The most painful part wasn't their mistake, it was the realization that truth doesn't always survive suspicion. Once people start doubting what's true, it doesn't matter how honest you are, your truth loses its voice. Forgiveness came last, and it was the hardest to understand. Forgiving my family wasn't just about letting go of what they did. It was about accepting that they acted out of ignorance, not cruelty. It was about realizing that love can be flawed, and people can make choices that break you without meaning to. At first, I couldn't forgive them. I couldn't look at them without feeling the sting of betrayal. Every time my mother tried to speak, I heard the sound of that folder opening. Every time my father offered comfort, I remembered his voice asking if I was hiding something. Every time my brother laughed nervously, I saw him sitting in front of my laptop, crossing a line he didn't understand. Forgiveness didn't come through words or apologies, it came through silence, through time, through watching them learn the meaning of respect all over again. There were days when I thought forgiveness would never come. I carried the weight of what happened everywhere I went, like an invisible bruise that refused to heal. My work felt heavier, my focus dimmed, my sense of peace replaced by caution. But then, slowly, I began to see small changes in them. My father started asking before touching anything on my desk. My mother stopped trying to explain and instead just listened. My brother, who used to take things lightly, began treating my boundaries with care. Those small gestures weren't apologies, they were understanding taking shape. And understanding, I realized, is where forgiveness begins. It doesn't erase the pain, it acknowledges it. It says, I see what I did. I know I hurt you. I won't do it again. The hardest part of forgiveness is realizing that it doesn't always come with reconciliation. You can forgive someone and still feel the distance between you. That distance doesn't mean love is gone, it means love has changed form. My family and I still loved each other deeply, but the way we expressed it was different now. There was a quietness in our love, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. We learned to respect silence, to understand that closeness doesn't mean access. That lesson came at a price, but it was a necessary one. It taught us that even in love, there must be boundaries, and even in forgiveness, there must be awareness over time. I started to see privacy not as isolation, but as protection. It wasn't about shutting people out, it was about preserving the space where I could breathe freely without fear of intrusion. Truth, too, became less about explanation and more about consistency. I stopped trying to convince anyone of what was real and started living in a way that made my truth undeniable. And forgiveness, though still fragile, became the bridge that allowed us to exist together again without resentment. It was a quiet, unspoken kind of peace, the kind that doesn't announce itself but lives in small gestures like shared meals, laughter that feels lighter, and moments when silence no longer feels like distance. There was one evening, months after everything had settled, when I found my mother sitting by herself in the living room. The lights were dim, and she was looking at an old family photo. She turned to me and said softly that she finally understood what privacy meant. It wasn't about hiding, it was about trust. That sentence stayed with me because it summed up everything we had gone through. Privacy isn't selfishness, it's self-respect. Truth isn't always loud, sometimes it's quiet, steady, and patient. And forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering without pain. What happened between us broke something, but it also built something new, an understanding that love isn't about knowing everything. It's about protecting the spaces that belong only to each other, and within those spaces, learning that forgiveness is the quiet proof that love still exists even after the trust has been broken.